Hi, my name is Andrew Berry and welcome to At the Benches YouTube channel. How much is enough, or how much is too much, or how much is not enough? These are the questions that beginners often ask themselves when it comes to soldering. It's always nice to have a fantastic joint with lots of solder on it to make sure that you get a nice firm joint. But you use too much solder, you're going to be filing it off and it goes into your tray or in your skin, but you do save all the bits of enamel, bits of filings, but that's a bit of a waste. So always try to use just enough solder for the job in question. Now I've got two rings in front of me here, identical rings. We're going to solder one with just enough solder and one with too much solder. Now, if you use too much solder, you're going to waste it. You're going to go through the solder really, really quickly. As I said, you're going to be filing it off. It's going to go in your tray. Yes, you can send it back to the refiners, but you get some money back on it, but that's a complete waste. So I would always try and use just enough solder. So how much is just enough solder? Well, when you come to prepare your solder joints, they really do have to be nice, tight fitting joints with no gaps. I always try and hold it up to a bright light or a piece of white paper or the wallpaper behind you or whatever you've got to see if you can actually see through the joint. If you see a very, very slight little bit occasionally across the joint, that's going to be fine. But if you have a decent gap that you can really see through it, or the ends of the metal do not come together flush and there's a bit of a gap in between the top like that, that's just not good enough. The joints have to be completely flush. Now, solder comes in all various different sizes. It comes in solder paste, it comes in strip, it comes in wire, and so forth. So in this case, we're going to be looking at strip solder. The solder comes in different sizes, whether it's going to be enameling or hard or medium or easy. That refers to the melting points of the solder. It comes in a set size. Now, usually the metal, the solder, is usually quite thick, and it is really awkward to cut the right size piece of solder for the joint in question. I always use a pair of shears, nice, really quite small shears. Some people use actually solder snips to cut little pallions of solder. My argument with that is that comes in pretty much a set size, and no solder joint is the set size. You have some very thin wire, some thick wire, some flat section, some round section. So it all depends upon what you're going to be soldering. Now, the way I look at it is that you just need enough solder to fill to go between those two pieces of metal when they come together. That's all you need. If you have any excess that runs on the outside or the inside of the joint, well, then you've used too much solder. You're going to file it off, you're going to waste it. So I would always look at it, I would need the same amount of solder as the cross section of the piece we're going to be soldering. Now, for argument's sake, I've got two rings. I'm going to show you exactly what I mean here. The width of this ring is around about 2.5 millimeters. The thickness is 1.2 millimeters. So ideally, I would need a piece of solder approximately the same cross section, so around about 1.2 millimeters wide by about 2.5 millimeters across. That is all you really need. Now, when you have the solder, it comes in a set thickness. That is going to be too thick for what you're going to need. So I would always try and either use a little bench block like this to put the solder upon with a nice hammer or even an old hammer, and to hammer it thinner. Or if you have a rolling mill, pop it through the rolling mill and take it down to around about, this is 0.2 of a millimeter. The original thickness was 0.6. So I've taken it down to a third of its original thickness. So why am I doing that? Well, it's going to be easier for you to cut it. Obviously, the metal is thinner, plus that's a nice thickness, so you can cut your piece that's about 2.4 millimeters by 1.2 millimeters, and that's all you're going to need. So let me bring the camera in nice and close for you to see what I'm doing. I'll give you an example of trying to cut the end off this thick bit of solder here and also cutting the right amount of solder from the thin end here. So we've got the two rings in front of us with really nice close fitting joints. I've got some flux, I've got a little bit of borax. I'm going to paint that on the front and the back as well, just to ensure that the flux goes through the joints. So when I come to cut the solder, this is the thick end here, this is the thin end down here. And what I'm going to do is cut, should try and make sure that the solder is nice and clean as well. Beforehand, let's just remove some of these oxides as well off here. And that will ensure the solder will flow nicely. So we're going to cut, usually what the idea is, you cut a fringe on the end of the solder. You'll come along and you'll go down, and with the shears you'll cut a fringe like that. You would then straighten out that fringe like that, and now these are your little pieces of solder that we can cut off. I wanted one around about 1.2 millimeters. That's about the right depth that I need. So let's just cut one off, run about the right sort of size for my piece of metal. There it is on the end of my finger. Let's just pop that down on my block. I'm going to put that on the left-hand side here. And likewise, on this end of my solder, this is the thin end. It's a lot more thin and bendy. And again, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm going to cut a fringe along the bottom or along the one end here. Easier to cut, much easier, and do exactly the same thing on here. Straighten that up and then cut a piece of solder, the same sort of cross section as we have. And I'm going to put that on the right hand side. Now, the solder joints do have to be very close fitting. They should be for the most maximum amount of strength. I'm going to put a little bit of flux on each of the solder pieces. So as you can see, the solder pieces are pretty much the same size. Apart from this one is a lot thicker, this one is a lot thinner. So let's solder these together and I'll show you the result. So this is the one ring with the solder that is the thickness that it came. Put it on the top, nothing wrong so far. Heat it up, flame either side. There we go. Okay, soldered. And here's the one over here. Put that on top. And let's warm this up. There we go. Turn them over, make sure the solder has come through to this side as well. Beautiful. Turn this one over and have a look at this now. Beautiful. Okay, perfect solder joints. We've pulled the solder through from one side to the other. That's looking absolutely fantastic. Let's just pop them in the pickle and I shall show you what we've got. So at first glance, they look pretty much identical. But this one on the left-hand side here, we've got quite a bit of excess solder on the outside edge here. The solder has flowed quite a bit. The solder has flowed quite a bit onto the surface here as well, and also onto this side. And there's lots of solder, and especially on the inside, you can see how that solder has really come through onto the inside, and that's quite a bit of solder has come through. Now this is the one that we have just done with the most minimal amount of solder, and it looks pretty much the same, apart from you don't have that large area of solder on the top as we do with this one here. The sides, yes, you've got a little bit of solder here, but not much. a little bit of solder here. That has just come through onto that joint here. And if you look on the inside of the ring, you can see there's hardly anything come through. This black here is a bit of flux, by the way, in case you're wondering. So hardly any solder has come through. Now, whilst both soldering jobs are beautiful, exactly the same, the solder's been pulled through, this one is going to need more cleaning up because we've got to get rid of the excess solder on the outsides and the edges and the insides. This one has more cleaning up to do, so this one's going to take longer to clean up than this one. There's less solder on this one than this one. And also, by the time we start to file all this solder off, that is a lot of waste. That's a wastage of solder when we could have put on a piece that was a third of the thickness of it, and we'll have the most minimal amount of cleaning up to do. This applies to any soldering joint that you've got. You need to apply the most minimal amount of solder possible to do a most successful job. When you're a beginner, it always does pay to use that little bit more solder because so you're learning and you want to know how things are going to work and how the solder is going to flow and so forth. And if the solder flows more towards one side of the joint than on the other, you can always pull the solder back. So a little bit extra solder in that instance is beneficial. But once you have developed your soldering technique, you know exactly what you're doing, you know how to prepare a joint, how the solder moves towards the heat and so forth, you can then reduce the amount of solder. So how much is too much? That first piece was just too much. How much it was enough? That second piece then, and perhaps even that was a little bit too much as well because there was a bit of excess that flowed on the surface. And also you do need to remove all the solder from the surface of a piece because it will oxidize slightly differently from the rest of the silver. So you're going to see perhaps a different color because the silver solder has a slightly different alloy that allows it to melt before the actual silver does. So you'd have a lot more cleaning up and a lot more hassle trying to remove all the solder from that piece than the other. So what's the correct amount of solder? Preferably the cross section of the material that you're working with or the area that you are trying to solder to cover. So I hope that has helped you knowing exactly how much solder you need to put upon your soldering jobs. My name's Andrew Berry, and don't forget, please, if you haven't subscribed already, I'd love you to smash that bell icon if that's something that you're into. Don't forget, click the like button if you like this, give us a high five, and if you don't like the film, I'm sorry, but leave a comment down below. Let me know why you don't like it and perhaps I can do something about it next time. But in the meantime, my name's Andrew Berry for At The Benches YouTube channel. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.